The smell of blood reached her before she understood what it meant. It was faint at first, copper and iron mixed with pine resin and cold mud, carried on the night wind that slipped through the gaps in the carriage curtains. Ellie pressed her fingers against the fabric and told herself it was nothing. A wounded animal on the road, a hunter returning late from the forest. Anything but what the sharp, instinctive part of her mind was already screaming. She had learned long ago not to trust that part. The carriage rocked steadily along the forest road, the wheels grinding against wet stone, the horses breathing in heavy rhythmic puffs that condensed into little white clouds she could see through the gap in the curtain. The lantern hanging outside swayed. The driver, Edmund, had not spoken in over an hour. That, too, she told herself, was nothing. Edmund was a quiet man. She adjusted the wool blanket across her lap and looked down at the boy sleeping against her side. Rowan was 6 years old, dark-haired, long-lashed, with his father's jaw already forming beneath the soft roundness of childhood. He slept the way children sleep when they feel completely safe, mouth slightly open, one small fist curled against his cheek, the other gripping the edge of her cloak. He had fallen asleep, holding her hand, and she had not moved even when her arm grew numb, because he had only just stopped crying 2 hours ago, and she had no intention of waking him. She was not his mother. She needed to remember that. She was his father's second choice, his court's acceptable compromise, the woman who had been quietly inserted into the role because the first woman, the real one, the beloved one, had died 3 years ago and left a gap that needed filling for political purposes. Ellie had known this when she accepted the betrothal. She had told herself she could live inside the outline of someone else's life, that she could be useful. That usefulness was enough. It had almost been true. Then she had met Rowan, and usefulness had become something different entirely. The carriage lurched. Not the ordinary lurch of a road wheel catching a rut, but a violent sideways jolt that threw her against the door and sent the boy sliding from the seat. She caught him before he hit the floor, barely, her arms locking around him on pure reflex, her heart slamming into her ribs. "Edmund?" she called. No answer. The horses screamed. That sound, high, wild, nothing like the sounds horses made under normal fear, cut through the walls of the carriage like a blade. Rowan woke instantly, gasping, his eyes wide and white in the darkness. "Ellie, shh." She pressed him behind her, against the back wall of the seat. "Stay behind me. Do not move." The carriage stopped, not slowed. Stopped, with the abruptness of something hitting a wall. She heard the crack of wood, the terrible slide of something heavy on the roof above them, and then silence that lasted exactly 3 heartbeats before the shouting began. Men's voices, at least 4, maybe more. The clash of steel, a sound she recognized from the perimeter guards at the estate, the particular flat crack of an arrow striking wood rather than flesh. Then another sound, the one she had been dreading since she first smelled blood on the wind. Edmund's voice, cut short. She did not allow herself to stop and feel it. There was no time. She looked at Rowan. His face was absolutely white, and he was trembling so hard she could feel it through the wood between them. But he was not crying, and he was not screaming. And for a 6-year-old child who had just been woken by horses screaming in the dark, that was something close to extraordinary. "Listen to me," she said quietly. "I need you to be very still and very silent. Can you do that?" He nodded. "I'm going to open the door on this side. We are going to get out and go into the trees. You hold my hand and you do not let go for any reason. Not any reason. Do you understand me?" He nodded again. She could see him forcing himself to breathe slowly, forcing himself to be brave. Something in her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She eased the latch on the right side door, the side away from the shouting, and pushed it open 1 inch at a time. Cold air flooded in, smelling of pine and wet leaves and something darker underneath, something animal and thick that made her wolf senses, such as they were, pull tight with alarm. She was not a shifter. She had no wolf. In a world built entirely around those who did, she had always been the wrong kind of person in every room she entered. She had compensated with other things: observation, patience, the ability to read a situation before anyone in it knew it had changed. Lord Aldrich had called it useful, in the same tone he used for a well-sharpened quill. She pushed the door open wide enough for a child and a woman to slip through, and she lifted Rowan out first, set him on the ground, and followed. The forest swallowed them immediately. She moved without light, one hand tight around Rowan's, the other arm extended to feel for branches. Behind her, she could hear the fight continuing. Steel, shouting. A horse crashing through undergrowth somewhere to the left. She counted her steps. She kept her breathing even. She did not run, because running in darkness breaks ankles and makes noise, and neither of those things were options she could afford. 30 steps in, she stopped and pressed her back against the wide trunk of an old pine. Rowan pressed himself against her without being asked, his face against her ribs, both arms wrapped around her waist. She put one hand on the back of his head and held him there, and she looked back through the trees toward the road. She could see firelight. One of the carriage lanterns had fallen and caught something. Hay from the horse's pack, maybe, or the carriage curtains. In the orange and jumping light, she could see shapes moving, and she made herself look at them long enough to count. 6 men, armed. Not in the colors of any neighboring territory she recognized. Deliberately so, she realized. The tunics were plain dark wool, no insignia, no house markings. Someone had paid for this, to look like ordinary road violence, the kind that happened to travelers unlucky enough to take the forest route after nightfall, the kind that left no witnesses. She pressed her lips together and looked away from the fire. There had been only 8 people who knew which road she was taking tonight. She had counted them twice, standing in the courtyard at dusk, while Edmund loaded the last of the trunks. 8 people. Lord Aldrich's steward, 2 of the house guards, her own lady's maid, who had wept at the departure, the head groom, the cook, who had pressed a wrapped parcel of food into her hands, and Lord Aldrich himself, and his brother Fenwick, who had stood at the far end of the courtyard with his arms folded and his expression perfectly, carefully neutral. The expression of a man watching something he had already decided he did not need to feel guilty about. She had thought, at the time, that it was only his usual coldness, his ordinary contempt for a woman he considered beneath his brother's station. Standing in the dark with Rowan trembling against her ribs, she understood that it had been something else entirely. Rowan tilted his head back and looked up at her. Even in the dark, she could read his face. He was waiting. He was trusting her to have a plan. She did not have a plan. She had a direction. Deeper into the forest, away from the road, toward the high ground where the trees thinned, and where, if she remembered the maps she had studied before this journey, there was a river crossing 2 miles north. Beyond the crossing was the edge of another territory, a different lord, different guards, different rules, different enough to survive. She bent close to Rowan's ear and said, barely a breath, "We're going to walk north, quietly, like we're trying not to wake anyone up." He understood immediately. He had grown up in a house where silence was the safest strategy. They moved deeper into the dark. The cold deepened the further they went from the road. Ellie felt it first in her hands, the kind of cold that seeps through wool and settles into the joints, making fingers stiff and slow. She kept Rowan's hand inside both of hers when the ground allowed it, warming him more than herself, and she did not mention it because there was nothing useful to say about cold in the middle of a forest in the middle of the night with armed men somewhere behind them. She focused on the ground instead, on the particular sound each step made. dry leaf versus wet moss versus loose stone, and on adjusting her weight accordingly. She had grown up on the edge of a small village, before Lord Aldrich's household, before betrothal documents and silk-trimmed expectations, and she had walked forests then too, though for different reasons. She had not forgotten. Rowan walked silently beside her. She could feel his effort in the tightness of his grip, in the controlled steadiness of his breathing, in the way he lifted his feet more carefully every time a branch snapped somewhere in the distance. He was, she thought, working very hard at being someone who was not frightened, and the working of it was more visible than the fright itself would have been. "You are doing very well," she told him, barely above silence. He did not answer, but his grip loosened very slightly. Just enough. They moved for what she estimated was close to an hour before she heard the river. It was a low sound at first, beneath the wind and the creak of the pines. A persistent low rushing that grew steadily until it was undeniable, and she could feel it faintly in the soles of her feet, the way large water makes the ground remember it. She adjusted their path toward it, and within another 100 steps, the trees thinned and the bank appeared, a dark ribbon of moving water, wide enough to matter, edged with pale stones that glowed faintly in the moonlight. She stopped at the bank and assessed it. Wide. Fast enough to be dangerous in the dark. The crossing she had seen on the map would be further east, a shallow ford marked by stacked stones on either bank, the kind of crossing that local hunters used in autumn. She looked east along the bank and saw nothing she could identify. Turned west and saw the same. Rowan looked at the water and then up at her. He said nothing. "We'll find the ford," she said, as though she was certain. They went east. She found it 12 minutes later, the stacked stones half collapsed but still there, and the water at the marked point churning whitely over a flat shelf of rock that lay perhaps a foot beneath the surface. She tested it with one foot before she stepped, then turned to Rowan. "I'll carry you across," she said. "Hold on." "I'm too heavy," he said immediately. This was, she had noticed, a thing he said whenever someone offered to do something physical on his behalf. She had once watched him refuse his father's arm on a muddy path, at 4 years old, and take a spectacular fall into the mud, rather than accept the help. The fall had not changed his position. "You are not," she said. "I am," he said. "I've grown." She looked at him for one moment, 7 stone at most, with his father's serious expression and his late mother's dark eyes, and felt the absurd, inappropriate urge to laugh. "You have," she said gravely. "It's remarkable. Nevertheless." She picked him up. He wrapped his arms around her neck with the resigned dignity of someone who had lost an argument on procedural grounds and was determined to maintain his composure about it. She stepped into the ford. The water was glacial. It hit her ankles, her shins, climbed to her knees at the deepest point of the crossing, and she felt her legs go from cold to burning to briefly, frighteningly numb, before she reached the far side and stumbled up the bank. She set Rowan down on the grass and stood for a moment with her hands on her knees, breathing. "Your dress," Rowan said quietly. "It will dry." She straightened. "Come on." They were on different ground now. She could feel it in some way she could not have explained. A different quality to the air, a different sound to the trees, as though the forest itself knew where one lord's land ended and another's began. She did not know whose land this was. She had not thought that far ahead on the map. She had only thought, away from the road, across the river, out of reach of whoever Fenwick had sent into the dark. She thought about Fenwick now as they walked, because thinking about it was not the same as stopping, and she needed to understand it before she could decide what to do about it. Lord Aldrich had no heir. He had Rowan, but Rowan was not his son by blood. He had said this himself, quietly, in the second week of their engagement, sitting across a table from her in the estate library, with the careful frankness of a man who respects the person he is about to disappoint. Rowan was the child of Aldrich's first wife, and a man she had loved before the marriage was arranged. Aldrich had known. Aldrich had accepted it, had raised the boy as his own, had loved him in the quiet and deliberate way that seemed to be the only way Aldrich knew how to do anything. But Aldrich's title and lands would pass, in the absence of a blood heir, to Fenwick. Unless Aldrich married again, unless a new wife produced a blood heir, unless the line was secured and Fenwick's inheritance became contingent rather than guaranteed. She had been so focused on the betrothal, on the strangeness of it, on what it meant for her, on the boy she was unexpectedly growing to love, that she had not looked at it from Fenwick's angle, had not calculated what she represented to him. Not a woman, not even a person particularly. A problem, a probability, a future that closed off his own. She was very cold. Her skirts were soaked to the thigh, and the temperature was still dropping, and her feet had stopped feeling like her own feet about 10 minutes ago. Rowan had stopped complaining about the pace, and was simply walking with his head down, conserving energy in the instinctive way of small creatures in the cold. She was trying to decide whether to look for shelter or to keep moving when she heard it. A sound ahead. Not the forest sounds she had been cataloging for 2 hours, but a human sound. Footfall, heavy and deliberate. Not the careful silence of a man trying not to be heard, but the confidence of one who assumed the forest was his to move through. She pulled Rowan behind a tree and held her breath. The figure that emerged from the darkness ahead of them was enormous. She registered this in the way you register something that does not fit any existing category. Not fear, exactly, but a recalibration. He was tall in the way that buildings were tall, with the kind of breadth across the shoulders that suggested his silhouette would block a doorway without effort. He wore dark traveling clothes, a heavy cloak with the hood pushed back, and he moved through the underbrush with a stillness that should not have been possible for someone his size. The controlled, deliberate quiet of a predator. At his hip, a sword. At his back, what appeared to be a second blade. He had stopped. He was looking directly at the tree she was hiding behind. Not toward it. At it. As though he could see through the bark. She was aware, with the particular clarity that extreme circumstances produce, that she had no weapons, no pack, no supplies of any kind, soaking wet skirts, numb feet, and a child pressed against her back. She was also aware that running was not an option because she would not get 5 steps before someone with a shifter's speed caught her, and whatever this man was, he was not human in the ordinary sense of the word. She stepped out from behind the tree. It was not bravery. It was calculation. Standing still gave him the choice of how this began. Stepping forward, at least, was a choice she made herself. She moved Rowan behind her with one hand, kept her eyes on the man's face, and said, her voice remarkably steady, which surprised even her, "I am not on this land by intention. We were traveling the South Road and our carriage was attacked. I ask passage only." He looked at her. Not the kind of looking that assessed threat, or calculated advantage, or decided what category to put her in. The kind of looking that simply looked, as though he was reading something written in very small letters and needed to take the time to read it properly. Then his eyes moved to Rowan. Something changed in his expression. Not softened, that was not the word for it. Settled. As though something that had been held at tension had found a point of stillness. "The South Road," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, with the cadence of someone who had learned long ago that volume was unnecessary when authority was sufficient. "There were riders, half an hour behind me." He looked back at her. 6 men, dark wool, no insignia. She felt the cold move through her in a different way than it had before. "Yes," she said. "They were not road bandits." It was not a question. "No," she said. "They were not." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he looked past her, into the forest they had come from, and something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, but she was watching closely. It was the shift of a man who has already made a decision and is now simply executing it. "Come with me," he said. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he said. "You don't." He turned and began to walk, deeper into the forest, without looking back. Rowan's hand found hers in the dark. She felt the small fingers close around her own, steady and certain, the way children trust before they have learned the cost of trusting. She looked at the man's retreating back, looked at the dark behind her, from which she had come, where 6 men were presumably still moving, still searching. She followed. He led them to a hunting lodge. It was small, one main room, a loft above reached by a narrow ladder, a stone hearth that took up most of the far wall, but it was solidly built, with thick timber walls and a door that closed with the kind of heavy iron latch that suggested someone had thought about what might need to be kept out. It sat in a shallow clearing, invisible from any path she had crossed, which meant either the man knew this forest in the way that people know their own skin, or he had built it specifically to be invisible, which told her something different and perhaps more important. He did not speak while he built the fire. He moved with the same unhurried efficiency she had noticed in the forest. No wasted motion, no performance. The quiet competence of someone who had done this 10,000 times and found no reason to make it interesting. The fire caught quickly. Heat moved into the room in slow, widening circles, and Ellie felt the cold begin to release its grip on her hands and face, though her feet were still disconnected from the rest of her, in a way she was trying not to think about. Rowan had sat himself on the low wooden bench near the hearth without being told. He was watching the man with the focused, unblinking attention that children gave to things they had not yet categorized. Not afraid. Assessing. The man straightened from the fire and turned, and for the first time, Ellie had the light to see him properly. He was perhaps 30 or close to it. It was difficult to be certain with shifters, who aged differently and wore years in different places than ordinary men. Dark hair, kept short. Eyes that in the firelight appeared the color of deep water, not quite green, not quite gray, the color of the sea in winter. A jaw that had not seen a blade in several days. A scar along the left side of his neck, thin and old, the kind that came from something faster than a sword. He was looking at her feet. "Your boots need to come off," he said. "I'm aware," she said. "The cold will have reached the skin by now. If you don't warm the feet slowly, the returning blood—" "I know what happens," she said. "I grew up near a river." He looked at her. The expression was not impatience and not amusement, something quieter than either, and more difficult to read. He went to the loft ladder, climbed it in 2 steps, and came back down with a folded blanket and a pair of heavy wool stockings that were clearly his and would be comically large on her. He set them on the bench beside Rowan without comment, and turned to a shelf on the wall, where there were several covered clay pots and a small iron kettle. Ellie sat on the bench, removed her boots with some difficulty, and began the unpleasant process of persuading her feet that they were still attached to her. Rowan leaned over and examined them with the grave diagnostic interest of someone who had accompanied her to the estate healer, often enough to know what to look for. "They're not white," he reported. "That's good, isn't it? The healer said when they're white, it means they'll be fine," she said. "Thank you." He nodded, satisfied, and looked back at the man, who was now heating water in the iron kettle. "What is your name?" Rowan asked him. She expected a pause, a deflection, the kind of careful non-answer that powerful men gave to questions from strangers, which revealed more than any direct answer would have. Instead, without turning from the fire, the man said, "Cassian." Rowan considered this. "I'm Rowan," he said. "That is Ellie. She is going to marry my father, except I think something has gone wrong with that." "Rowan," Ellie said, It's true, he said without defensiveness. It is also our private business. He found us in a forest, Rowan said, with the irrefutable logic of childhood. I think he already knows something has gone wrong. Cassian set the kettle on the iron arm over the fire and turned then. He looked at Rowan first, that same settling look she had noticed in the forest, and then at Ellie. Are you injured? He asked. No. The boy? He's well. The men on the road, he said. How many knew your route? She looked at him carefully. He had asked it the way someone asks a question when they already understand the shape of the answer and want to know if she did too. 8, she said. Of those 8, one had more reason than the others. Who does the child belong to? Lord Aldrich of the Westmere Estate. Something moved behind Cassian's eyes. Not surprise, recognition, as if the name located something on a map he had already been consulting. Aldrich has a brother, he said. Fenwick, she said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted and resettled. Outside, wind moved through the pines in long, slow waves. Rowan had stopped watching Cassian and started watching the fire instead, his head drooping slightly, the particular boneless quality of a child losing the fight against exhaustion. Aldrich is dead, Cassian said. The words arrived quietly. She had been partly braced for them. Some cold portion of her mind had been building toward this conclusion since the first sound of steel on the road. But braced was not the same as ready. She felt them move through her chest like cold water, slower and more thorough than she expected. She thought of Aldrich in the library, turning pages with the patient care of a man who loved books more than he loved most people. Aldrich at table, cutting Rowan's meat without being asked and pretending he had not done it. Aldrich sitting across from her in the engagement meeting, telling her the truth about Rowan's parentage with the directness of a man who had decided she deserved honesty if she was going to be asked to give up her ordinary life. She pressed her lips together. Looked at the fire. When? She said. 3 days ago. A hunting accident is what Fenwick's people are calling it. The flatness in his voice indicated precisely what he thought of that. Word reached me this morning. I was already moving through this territory on other business. What business? She said. He looked at her steadily. The kind that involves knowing when men ride through my forest without permission. The emphasis was slight but deliberate. She heard it land. His forest. She looked at him again, recalibrated. She had been so occupied with the immediate, the cold, the child, the men on the road, that she had not asked herself the question she should have asked the moment she stepped out from behind that tree. Not who are you, but what are you, in the precise sense that mattered in this world. The logging lodge, the quality of the silence he moved in, the way the word my had landed with the weight of something that was not metaphor. You're the territorial lord, she said. He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Of which territory? A pause. Not hesitation, consideration, as if he was deciding how much information changed her situation and in which direction. The Ashvale Reach, he said. She sat very still. The Ashvale Reach was not a territory. It was a kingdom. The largest consolidated pack territory in the north, running from the high passes to the seacoast, governed for the past 11 years by an alpha king who had taken it from 3 warring lords and built something unified from the wreckage. She had heard his name in the same breath as words like undefeated and ruthless, and occasionally just, which was rarer and perhaps more frightening. She looked at the man sitting calmly across from her, heating water in a hunting lodge, with no crown and no guard, and no ceremony of any kind, and understood several things simultaneously. He was here alone because he chose to be. He had no guard, because none were necessary, and he had found them in the dark, not because they were lucky, but because very little moved through this forest without his knowledge. Rowan had fallen fully asleep against her arm, boneless and absolute in the way of children who have finally accepted that an adult is managing the situation. She shifted to support him more fully and looked at Cassian. "Why did you bring us here?" she said. He lifted the kettle from the fire and poured water into a clay cup, set it on the bench within her reach, and then sat back in the wooden chair across from the hearth. "Because 6 men with no insignia were hunting a woman and a child on my road," he said, "and I wanted to know why." "And now?" she said. "Now that you know?" He looked at her across the fire. The light moved over the planes of his face, steady, unreadable, the face of a man who had learned to keep his thoughts somewhere that did not show. "Now I want to know what you intend to do about it," he said. She looked at him, at the fire, at Rowan's sleeping face, slack and trusting against her sleeve. Something that had been formless in the back of her mind since the forest, since the road, since the moment she understood what the smell of blood on the wind meant, began to take shape. "Fenwick will claim the estate," she said. "He will claim the title and the lands and everything that goes with them. And Rowan—" She stopped, started again more carefully. "Rowan has no legal standing. He is not Aldrich's blood. Fenwick knows that. He will use it." "Yes," Cassian said. "Aldrich had documents," she said slowly, "in the estate library. Correspondence that, if Aldrich suspected his brother, if he had any reason to suspect, he would have recorded it. He recorded everything. He trusted the written word more than he trusted people." She paused. "If those documents exist, they would not be safe in Fenwick's hands." Cassian was quiet for a long moment. The fire settled again, throwing new shadows. "The estate is 4 hours from here by horse," he said. "By morning, Fenwick's people will be in every room." "I know," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You can't go back there." "No," she said, "but someone could." The silence stretched between them, and in it she felt something shift. Not in her feelings, which were still armored and careful, and nowhere near trusting anything that had not been proven, but in the shape of the problem. It had changed. It was no longer only about surviving the night. It was about what came after. She woke before dawn to the sound of horses. Not close, a 1/4 mile, maybe more, moving on what must have been a wider path than anything she had crossed the night before. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious, and Rowan was already awake beside her, sitting upright on the narrow cot where someone had moved them both during the night, his dark eyes sharp and waiting. Cassian was at the door. He had one hand flat against the timber, and his head tilted at a slight angle. The listening posture of a shifter, she had learned, was a different thing from the listening posture of an ordinary person. It was whole body and absolute, a quality of suspension that made the air around him feel held. Then he straightened. "Mine," he said simply. He opened the door and stepped outside. She stayed where she was, one hand on Rowan's shoulder, and listened to the low exchange of voices outside. Cassian's, and then another, clipped and formal, the tone of a man accustomed to reporting. She caught words, but not sentences. Road clear, 6 accounted for. A pause. Then, the estate. She was at the door before she had decided to move. Outside in the pale gray of early morning, Cassian stood with 2 men in dark riding leathers, his own colors, she noted, which were no colors at all, the deliberate plainness of someone who did not need display to communicate authority. One of the men glanced at her. The other kept his eyes on Cassian with the trained discipline of someone who had learned not to look at things his lord had not indicated were relevant. Cassian turned when she appeared. "They've been to the estate," he said. There was no cushioning in how he said it. She had already noticed this about him. He did not soften information, but he also did not deliver it with any pleasure. It arrived the way he delivered everything, flat, direct, at the precise speed that allowed her to absorb it. "Fenwick arrived last night," Within 2 hours of the attack on the road. He has posted his own men at every entrance. The library, she said. My man couldn't get inside. The upper rooms were sealed before dawn. He paused. There is, however, a secondary location. Aldrich kept a sealed strongbox with his solicitor in the village of Crestham. Standard practice for estate lords. Documents, deeds, correspondence considered sensitive. My man knows the solicitor by name. She looked at him. Your man knows Aldrich's solicitor. I told you, he said. I was already in this territory on business. What business? She said again. He met her eyes. Fenwick has been petitioning lords on my border for the past 6 months, attempting to build alliances I have reason to object to. Aldrich was one of the last independent lords in this region who had not signed with him. A pause. When word came that Aldrich was dead and his betrothed had disappeared from a road that very few people knew she would be on, it seemed worth investigating personally. She absorbed this. The morning air was cold against her face, and the horses standing at the edge of the clearing exhaled slow white clouds in the stillness. You think Fenwick wants more than the estate, she said. I think, Cassian said carefully, that a man who kills his brother for a single estate and then sends riders to ensure the only witnesses disappear is not thinking about a single estate. Rowan had appeared at her elbow. She had not heard him come to the door. He stood with his arms crossed against the cold, wearing the overlarge wool blanket she had wrapped him in the night before as a makeshift cloak, and his expression was the expression of someone listening to a conversation he was not supposed to understand as well as he did. She put a hand on his shoulder without looking at him. Crestham, she said. How far? 2 hours by horse, southeast. Cassian glanced at Rowan. There is a keep, half a day's ride north. My people are there. The boy would be safe. She felt Rowan's shoulder go tight under her hand. He stays with me, she said. Cassian looked at her. Not a challenge, an assessment, measuring the quality of the statement, she thought, rather than its logic. It will be easier without, one of the riders began. He stays with me, she said again, in the same tone. Final, not loud. The kind of tone she had learned from Aldrich, who had been the only person in her adult life who managed firmness without volume. The rider stopped. Cassian did not contradict her. We leave in 10 minutes, he said instead, and turned back to his men. She used the 10 minutes to rebraid her hair, check Rowan's feet for cold damage, and eat 2 of the dried figs she found wrapped in cloth on the shelf inside the lodge. She fed half to Rowan, who ate them without comment. She drank the last of the water in her clay cup. She put her boots back on. They were still slightly damp, but her feet were her own again, which was sufficient. When she came outside, there were 4 horses saddled, and Cassian was already mounted on a black horse so large it made the others look like ponies. He watched her assess the remaining horses and said nothing. She chose the steadiest-looking one, a roan mare with calm eyes, and mounted without assistance, then reached down for Rowan, who climbed up behind her with practiced ease. He had ridden this way before. She knew this from the automatic way he settled his weight, hands gripping the back of the saddle rather than her waist, balancing himself. They rode southeast. Cassian set the pace, steady and serious, not urgent enough to alarm the horses, but fast enough to be purposeful. He rode slightly ahead and to the left, which put him between her and anything that might come from that direction, and she noticed this without commenting on it. The forest thinned as they climbed. By the time the sun was fully up, the trees had become scrubland, and then a long sloping hillside with the village of Crestham visible below. Perhaps 40 buildings, a mill, a stone bridge over a narrow river, and the larger structure of a merchant hall at the center. Ordinary. Quiet in the particular way of small places, whose ordinary life had not yet been touched by what was moving toward it. They left the horses at the edge of the village with one of Cassian's riders and went on foot. Cassian pulled his hood forward, not hiding exactly, but reducing the particular quality of attention that a man of his size and presence attracted in small places, where everyone knew everyone else's business. It helped, partially. People still looked, but they looked twice rather than stopping. The solicitor's office was above the mill, a narrow staircase, a low-beamed room smelling of ink, tallow candles, and the particular dusty warmth of papers that had been kept a long time. The solicitor himself was a small man of perhaps 60, with the watchful eyes of someone who had spent decades knowing things other people needed to not become common knowledge. He looked at Ellie, then at Cassian, then at Rowan. Then he went to the back room and came back with a sealed iron box. "Lord Aldrich left instruction," the solicitor said, setting the box on the table with the care of someone handling something that had weight beyond its physical measure. "In the event of his death under any circumstance other than age or illness, this is to be delivered to either his betrothed or the boy, whichever could be found first." He looked at her. He said, "If you came to tell you." He knew before the end. He was sorry he could not protect both of you better. The room was very quiet. Ellie looked at the box. Her hands were steady. She was distantly proud of this. "Do you have a key?" she said. "He left one with me." The solicitor produced it from his coat. "There's also a second document, held separately, which names the boy as his heir by formal adoption, filed with the territorial record 3 months ago. Before anyone asks, it is witnessed, sealed, and copied to 2 separate locations." She felt the air change. Rowan, who had been standing very still beside her, looked up. His face was difficult to read, which meant she had learned that he was feeling something large and was not ready to let it out yet. She opened the box. Inside were letters, perhaps 20, folded, sealed, dated in Aldrich's careful hand. The first she unfolded had Fenwick's name at the top. It was a copy of a correspondence sent 6 months earlier, outlining a proposal. A business arrangement. The sale of certain interests that were not Fenwick's to sell. And beneath it, Aldrich's own response. And beneath that, a third letter from someone whose name she did not recognize but whose seal, a burning tower on black, she filed away immediately. Beneath the letters was a document in a different hand, crisper, official. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at Cassian, who had been reading over her shoulder in silence. His expression had not changed, but his stillness had become the stillness of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion they had hoped was wrong. "The burning tower," he said quietly. "Lord Marath of the eastern coast. He has been funding Fenwick's alliances. If Fenwick consolidates this territory and marries into Marath's family..." He stopped. "He controls the northern trade routes," she said. "Both of them." He looked at the letters, then at her. "This is not about the estate." "No," she said. "It was never about the estate." She began folding the letters back carefully, one by one. "Fenwick will know the box exists," she said. "He will know we have been here before the day is out." "Yes." "And these documents, without support from someone with actual authority to act on them, are paper." She set the last letter down. "Proof without power is a story. Nothing more." Cassian was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had not changed in volume or cadence, but something in it had settled, the way a door settles when it locks. "Then we need both," he said. She looked at him, at the steadiness in his face, at the way he had said "we" without pausing over it, without offering it as a question, without making it into something she needed to negotiate or accept on formal terms. She thought about how she had stepped out from behind that tree in the dark. Not bravery, calculation. The choice to meet what was coming, rather than wait for it to arrive on its own terms. She picked up the iron box. Then let's not waste daylight, she said. The ride north to Cassian's keep took the rest of the day. Ellie spent most of it in silence, the iron box secured against her side, Rowan's weight warm and steady at her back. He had fallen asleep again before the first hour was out, the deep, boneless sleep of a child whose body had finally collected what the night owed it. And she had ridden with one hand on the reins and one braced against him, keeping him upright, watching the landscape change from scrubland to forest to the wide open territory of the northern reaches, where the trees grew in long, deliberate rows, and the road became something better maintained. Cassian rode ahead. Not far, within earshot, always, but far enough to give her the sense of space she had not asked for and somehow needed. She noticed this, filed it away beside the other things she had noticed. The way he had not asked her what was in the letters before she chose to show him. The way he had said nothing about her refusal to send Rowan to the keep without her. The way he had looked at the solicitor's table when she read Aldrich's final message, and then looked away, giving her the privacy of the moment, as though it was something that could be handed to a person. She did not trust him. She was clear about this inside herself, where clarity was the only thing she had any reliable control over. She did not trust him because she did not know him, and she had recently and thoroughly learned the cost of extending trust along the lines of reasonable assumption. But she noted the difference between distrust and the evaluation of evidence. She was evaluating evidence. The evidence so far was not bad. The keep appeared at dusk. Stone walls rising from a hillside above a river bend, practical and serious, built for defense rather than display. No decorative towers, no excessive height. The kind of structure that communicated, "We do not need to impress you." Guards at the gate came to attention when Cassian rode through, and the quality of their attention, sharp, genuine, not performed, told her something about how he ran things. He had them shown to rooms, separate, clean, with a fire already built and water heating in a basin. Rowan woke long enough to eat bread and warm broth at a small table, and then fell unconscious into a bed that was too large for him, and immediately claimed it entirely in the sprawling way of children who have been anxious for many hours and are now finally safe. She sat beside him until she was sure he was settled. Then she went to the window and looked out at the dark river below. She thought about Aldrich. She allowed herself to do this properly for the first time since the solicitor's room, when she had held the grief at the exact distance required to keep her hands steady. She let it be closer now. He had known, at the end. He had prepared what he could. He had been, in his quiet and deliberate way, trying to protect them from something he saw coming and could not stop. She was going to make sure it counted for something. In the morning, Cassian called council. It was a small one. 4 of his senior men, a woman who served as his chief advisor, and Ellie, who arrived at the table before anyone else and was already reading through the letters again when the others came in. Nobody commented on this. She suspected Cassian had said something before the meeting that made commentary inadvisable. She laid out what she knew systematically. The letters, the adoption document, the pattern of Fenwick's alliances with Lord Marath, the timeline, Aldrich's death, the attack on the road, Fenwick's arrival at the estate within hours, which, taken together, was not a sequence of unfortunate events, but a coordinated operation with a clear objective. The men at the table listened. Some of them looked at her with the particular expression of people recalibrating expectations in real time. She was accustomed to this. She waited until they were done recalibrating, and then continued. "Fenwick's position is currently strong," she said. "He holds the estate, he controls the narrative of Aldrich's death, and he has Marath's backing. But his position has 2 vulnerabilities. First, the adoption document is already filed and copied. He cannot unmake it without exposing the mechanisms he used, which means Rowan's claim to Aldrich's title is legally intact. Second, Fenwick's alliance with Marath is not yet public. The moment it becomes public, every lord on Cassian's border who has been uncertain about Fenwick's intentions will have reason to be certain." Cassian's chief advisor, a woman named Orla, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, who had the manner of someone who had been the most intelligent person in most rooms for a very long time and had made her peace with it, looked at the letters and then at Ellie. "You're proposing to make it public," Orla said. "I'm proposing to give the Alpha King cause to make it public," Ellie said. "Which is different. It cannot come from me. I am a woman with a box of letters and a child and an obvious motive. It needs to come from someone whose authority to act is not in question." The table was quiet. Cassian had been sitting at the head of it with his arms folded, listening without interrupting, and she had been aware of his attention throughout. Not because it was intrusive, but because it had a particular quality, the quality of someone who was genuinely following, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. Now he unfolded his arms and leaned forward. "A formal tribunal," he said. "Under the king's authority. The evidence presented publicly, Fenwick required to answer for it. Marath's involvement entered into the territorial record." He paused. "It will take 3 weeks to convene. Fenwick will use that time." "Then we give him less to use," she said. "Rowan's claim should be publicly confirmed before the tribunal. A formal recognition, even a preliminary one, removes Fenwick's simplest option, which is to make the adoption document disappear and argue the boy has no standing." Cassian looked at her steadily. "A recognition would need to come from the king's seat." "Yes," she said. "It would." Another silence. Orla looked at Cassian with the expression of someone who already knew what he was going to say. "I'll call the tribunal myself," he said, "and I'll enter the recognition into the king's record today." He looked at Ellie. "It will be public by nightfall." She looked at him, at the matter-of-fact way he had said it, as though it was simply the next logical step, and the weight of it, the political weight, the commitment it represented, the enemies it would make, was not worth mentioning because it had already been calculated and accepted. "You'll make an enemy of Fenwick," she said, "and of Marath." "Fenwick was already operating in my territory without my knowledge," he said. "That ended last night." He held her gaze. "And Marath I have been watching for 2 years. He was going to become a problem regardless. I would rather choose the ground." She looked at the table, at the letters, at everything that Aldrich had left behind in the only way he could. "All right," she said. The tribunal convened 18 days later in the Great Hall of the Ashvale Keep. Ellie had spent those 18 days in a state of focused, deliberate motion, working with Orla, reading territorial law, preparing the presentation of evidence, sitting with Rowan in the evenings when the day's work was done, and telling him, in plain and honest language, what was happening and why. He listened with the same serious attention he gave everything, asked precise questions, and thanked her each time with the grave courtesy of someone who had been told, too early, that feelings were a private matter. She had also spent those 18 days becoming, despite herself, aware of Cassian. Not in the way she would have predicted. Not in the way of romance stories, which she had always found imprecise about the actual mechanics of how trust developed. It was smaller than that. It was the way he appeared in the doorway of the council room in the evenings to tell her dinner was prepared, and waited, and never said you should rest because he had understood within the first day that she did not respond well to being managed. It was the way he spoke to Rowan, directly, without condescension, answering questions with real answers. It was the way he had, on the 5th day, left a territorial map on the table she worked at with 3 routes marked in different ink, without explanation, because he had noticed she was trying to calculate distances and did not have the right reference. She did not say anything about any of this. But she noticed it, the way you notice the temperature of a room changing, gradually, and then all at once. Fenwick stood before the tribunal and was, in the end, precisely what she had known him to be, a man who had planned in certainty and could not adapt to being seen. The letters destroyed his denial. The timeline destroyed his alibi. The testimony of Aldrich's solicitor, who had ridden 3 days to be present and delivered his account with the flat precision of a man who understood the historical weight of what he was saying, destroyed the last of it. Maerath, summoned by formal writ and unwilling to risk open war with the Ashvale Reach, presented counsel, who conceded the correspondence and offered terms. The terms were accepted, conditionally, with the understanding that Eastern Coast trade routes would be renegotiated under neutral oversight. Fenwick was stripped of any claim to the Westmere estate. The adoption document was formally entered into the territorial record and declared binding. Rowan was named Lord of Westmere, with a regency council to administer the estate until he came of age, a council that included Orla, the solicitor, and one name that Ellie had submitted herself, her own. She had not asked Cassian whether to do it. She had simply done it, and when he had seen the document, he had looked at her with something in his expression that was not surprise and not approval, but something that included both, and went past them. The night after the tribunal, she stood on the keep wall above the river and let the cold air do what she needed it to do, which was simply to be something she could feel that was not complicated. She heard him before she saw him. He came and stood beside her without being invited, which had stopped being an intrusion somewhere in the middle of the second week, and had become something she did not have a word for yet. They stood in silence for a while. The river moved below them, dark and constant. "Rowan asked me today," Cassian said, "whether I thought you would stay." She looked at the river. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know." A pause. "I told him that was your decision to make, and that either way it would be the right one." She was quiet for a moment. "That was," she said carefully, "a very good answer. I meant it." She knew he did. That was, she had found, one of the more disorienting things about him. The absence of the gap between what he said and what he meant. She had spent years learning to measure that gap in the people around her. With Cassian, the measurement came back 0, every time, and she did not know yet what to do with that except to keep checking and keep finding it true. "I am going to stay," she said, "for Rowan. He needs continuity. He's had enough taken from him." "Yes," Cassian said. "That is my reason," she said clearly. "I know," he said, with the faintest quality in his voice that was not quite amusement, but lived next door to it. She looked at him. He was looking at the river, his profile quiet in the darkness, and she thought about what it had cost him. The tribunal, the political exposure, the commitment of his authority and his name to a cause that had not been his, and had brought him conflict he had not needed to invite. She thought about the map left on her table, the dinners, the direct answers to a 6-year-old's questions at a time when most powerful men would not have bothered. She thought about a man in a forest at night who had found them in the dark and brought them to warmth and had not asked for a single thing in return. "Cassian," she said. He turned. She did not have a speech prepared. She had never been good at speeches. She was better at documents, at evidence, at the careful arrangement of provable things. But she understood, standing on the wall above the river, that some things could not be documented and did not require proof. They only required a decision. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He looked at her for a long moment. The river moved below them. Somewhere behind the walls, the keep was settling into its nighttime sounds, guards changing, a horse in the stable, the last light in a window going dark. "You did most of it," he said. "We did most of it," she said. He was quiet. Then, very simply, "Yes." She turned back to the river. He stayed beside her, and the night was cold, and she was warm, and that was enough. More than enough, for now. The rest would come in its own time, at its own pace, chosen freely rather than fallen into, and that made all the difference. In the weeks and months that followed, the Westmere estate was restored to order under Rowan's Regency Council. Fenwick, stripped of title and lands, was sent to a distant monastery under the Eastern Coast Lord's authority, a sentence that satisfied justice without requiring blood, which was, Ellie thought, exactly the kind of solution Aldrich would have found proportionate. Marath renegotiated his trade agreements as promised, and was not heard from again on the subject of northern alliances. Rowan went home to Westmere with Orla and the solicitor, and wrote Ellie a letter every week without exception, in his careful and increasingly confident hand. She wrote back every week without exception. He told her about the estate, about the horses, about the things he was learning. She told him about the keep, about the work, about the river in different weathers. Neither of them spoke about what was being built, because it was already built, and had been for a long time, and did not require naming. Cassian asked her, on a morning in early spring, whether she would consider making her role in the Ashvale Reach permanent. Not the regency, not the council seat, but something she would have to decide about in full knowledge of what she was deciding. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, and waited without pressure for her answer. She said yes. Not because of the protection, though it was real. Not because of the power, though it was significant. Not because of the mate bond, which she had felt for some time now as a quiet and steady presence at the edge of her awareness. Not a compulsion, not a demand, but a fact, like the river below the walls, always there, always moving. She said yes because she had watched him for months, in ordinary moments and critical ones, and the evidence was consistent and conclusive, and she trusted evidence. She said yes because Rowan, when she told him, broke into the widest smile she had ever seen on his serious face, and said with complete satisfaction, "I knew it. I told you. I told you in the forest." She said yes because for the first time in her life, the shape of the future she was choosing was one she had made herself. Not inherited, not assigned, not accepted out of usefulness, but built deliberately from the wreckage of what had tried to destroy her. On the day she was formally recognized as Lady of the Ashvale Reach, she wore Aldrich's signet ring on her right hand, not as sentiment, as record, as the thing that connected where she had come from to where she had arrived. Cassian stood beside her in the hall. Rowan sat in the front row with his arms folded and his chin up, in the exact posture of a boy trying very hard to look like he was not about to cry from happiness. She looked at both of them. At the hall. At the life that had been assembled from necessity and grief and refusal and evidence, and had somehow become something she recognized, without reservation, as her own. The past had been faced. The debts had been paid. The people who had tried to erase her had instead made her permanent. She was, at last, exactly where she was supposed to be,